So today we're going to talk a little bit about democratization and regime transitions. The video lectures today are going to be two parts. The first part, we're going to look at waves of democratization in this little timeline that I have here. And then in the second part, I'm going to walk you through the end of the transition paradigm by Thomas Crothers, which is one of the readings. So we'll do it in two parts, so I'll stop in between. This will be two videos for you today. So essentially what we're interested in looking at today is, so we've talked about different types of regimes, we've talked about democracies, dictatorships. Well, we know that democracy is a pretty new thing. So where did this come from? Is democratization inevitable? The answer is no, but we'll get to that in a second. So we're going to talk about different waves of democratization and reversals. So let's start. Oh, how do we move this forward? Okay, moving back. There we go. All right, sorry about that. All right, so the first wave of democratization is kind of the one that we always think about, the first countries adopting democracy. And there's some key cases that we would say. The first would be in Great Britain. The English Civil War, which happened in the 1600s, fought between the king and an oligarchic but still elected parliament. And so the idea was to establish a stronger parliament, to establish certain rights that the king was not able to contradict. So the Bill of Rights that came about in 1689 codified certain rights and liberties for subjects and kind of set out the rights of Parliament and rules for things like freedom of speech in Parliament, limiting the power of the monarch, and ensuring that royal absolutism was not going to be the norm. And by the time we get to 1884, we finally get a majority of male citizens are actually able to vote. So it's important to remember that even though there was a parliament, it was oligarchic in the sense that there was a few people who were able to vote and few people who were able to be in it. But it was a very slow progression towards democracy. In Great Britain, it wasn't the kind of exciting revolution that we'll see in the next two cases, the United States and France. So the American Revolution, 1700s, created the U.S. In many senses, it was a success ideologically, just in the sense that there was a true republic that had really never had a single dictator in it, and that there was a legislative system that functioned. Now, of course, you need to also take into consideration that slavery was still around after the American Revolution, and that civil rights were still quite limited. So even though it was seen as a success in the sense that here was a republic that was a democracy, there had never been kind of an authoritarian regime, there were still obviously limitations, just like in Great Britain, where a majority of males didn't get to vote until 1884. Again, a lot of Americans were not able to vote, were not able to participate in this democracy. So the beginnings of a democracy, but still limited. And the last key case, of course, is the late 1700s, was the French Revolution. It briefly allowed for a very wide franchise, so allowing lots of people to vote in their government. But obviously the French Revolutionary Wars and Napoleonic Wars kind of got in the way of that. There were kind of periods of reversion to restoration to autocratic rule. And so because of the ongoing wars that happened, again, democratization was limited in the French case. And it took a long time before we got to the Third Republic and kind of a more stable French Republic. All right, so what's key in all of this? So the first of the key characteristics of the first wave of democratization was that all of a sudden we were letting people vote, and that we were letting nearly all men vote. Unfortunately, not women were able to vote until later, but even just this idea that all men can vote is quite novel. Usually people needed to have some sort of property, they needed to have some amount of wealth in order to be considered eligible to participate in government, to participate in choosing who their elected representatives are going to be. That, people who didn't own land, who didn't have a certain amount of wealth, who didn't have a certain social status, for them to be participating in choosing their their leaders was actually quite novel. And then if you've taken 205, POE 205, you know responsible government, this idea that the executive has to maintain support of a majority in the elected assembly, was quite novel. We talk about it quite a bit in POE 205, the Canadian politics class, because it was really a novel idea that rather than the sovereign or the king or queen having key control over the government, instead it was the government giving advice and to the king or queen. And that the king or queen was required to take that advice and was required to support that advice and put that in place. So I like to share with you guys some key scholarly works just so you don't have to read them. And one of them, we could have went through there. All right, let's move on. One of them is Barrington Moore's Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. I have a copy of that, so if anyone's interested in taking a look, you're welcome to borrow it. It's actually a pretty good read. And what he argues is that the origins of democracies are always because of a bourgeois, of some sort of a middle class developing. So because social relations are changing between upper class and peasantry because of commercial agriculture, because of industrialization, when you get this middle class emerging, you're going to get democracy emerging. So he explains three routes from pre-industrial to modern world. And so the first is this bourgeois revolution, and that's what we saw in England, France, and the US. And so in this sense, the bourgeois, really the middle class, were the ones who were trying to break into politics. So, we talk about wanting to have, a majority of males being able to vote. When we talk about the French Revolution especially, it's this idea of the bourgeois trying to break into power where they didn't have it before. There are two alternative options. The second is the capitalist or reactionary form. So he talks a lot about Japan, and he calls this a revolution from above, so powerful landowners looking to get more power. And he says this one also ultimately results in fascism. There's a very weak bourgeois, and therefore these very powerful people end up ruling. And then the third route is communism, or revolution from below, so the idea of the peasantry really rising up and taking over power. And that one, of course, we know communism also tends to result in authoritarian rule. So it's really, if you could boil down Barrington Moore's argument into kind of one sentence, it's no middle class, no democracy. And it's really from the middle that democracy develops, especially in this first wave. So obviously we get first wave, then we get the first reversal. So in about post-World War I area, so early 20th century, we get the rise of more dictatorships. So countries that had previously been semi-democratic, or at least had some sort of responsible government, reverting into clear authoritarian regimes, usually caused by some sort of an economic downturn and disillusion with democracy. And so the clearest cases of these are Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, this idea that democracy hasn't worked for us. We are poor, we are not eating, we need to rediscover what made our country great. I realize the irony in saying that. And essentially, the result was post-World War I, a lot of dictatorships developed, especially in Europe. So obviously, World War II happens, and Hitler is defeated, Mussolini is defeated eventually, and you get what we call the second wave of democratization. So remember, the first wave was this early democratization from especially in the old European powers in Western Europe and America. And the second wave, we see really quite a growth, an explosion of democracy after World War II. So what was about this? What was going on there? So the first thing would be Allied occupation of a lot of post-World War II countries, the U.S., and other allies really bringing democratization and insisting on democratization in a lot of former Axis powers. So a lot of Western Europe and some of Eastern Europe that wasn't under the Soviet influence, really insisting on a move towards democratization. And the United States really played a key role in this. The idea there was, the Cold War was beginning, and they wanted stability in Western Europe. And so what they decided to do was really encourage European democracies to develop, and invested a lot of money in that happening. And then with the Cold War and a growing tension between Soviet versus American power, countries were really forced to take a side. And for example, if they wanted to be part of NATO, then they had to have some sort of democratic system. And that was really an incentive for a lot of countries, especially emerging countries, to become democratic and democratized, was to be able to join these Western multilateral institutions. Another kind of across the ocean, another wave was happening. Populism was growing in Latin America. So it was this leadership style that was really focused on mass politics and winning elections. There was great liberalization, suffrage open to women, voting age lowered, literacy requirements abolished, and a lot of leaders promising that there'd be material betterment. And the only challenge, and we'll see that when we see the second reversal, is that sometimes this was at the expense of personal freedoms. So an example of that would be Perón in Argentina, which had a very populist platform, but was also had some political suppression as part of that as well. So we'll talk about that in a second. The last of the phenomena was decolonization. So the idea that some of the great powers were leaving places in Africa and Asia, and leaving those countries to develop their own democratic systems. But again, we'll see in the reversal that that was not always a clear path towards democracy. And just bringing you attention to here, you can see that you get past the Second World War, and you just see this great explosion of democracies. And this is based on the polity scale, which we looked at last week. So let's move on to the second reversal. And so remember, we talked about the populism that was happening in Latin America. Unfortunately, that came with some authoritarian tendencies. And we can see that that in some Latin American countries, this reemergence of authoritarianism was rampant because of this populist leadership. The other thing that I alluded to just a few minutes ago was this idea of the failure of decolonization. And there was a large amount of authoritarian governments emerging after the decolonization of Africa, because building institutions is very, very difficult. And actually, one interesting statistics is that 1/3 of the working democracies in 1958 by 1970s had become authoritarian. So why did this democratic experiment of decolonization not work? So there's a few things going on. One of them is that former colonists saw democracy as an option to assuage anti-colonial opposition, whereas others, the emerging elites, saw democracy as a strategy to end their subordinate positions in the colonial economy. They wanted greater access to the state, improved standards of living, and social status. But because of the authoritarian character of the colonial economy, building a liberal democracy was really tricky. And so essentially, some of these emerging elites were starting to build into institutions of power their own power and their own profit. And especially when there's a large urban-rural divide, some traditional structures rather than civil society became more prominent in these countries. And so democratization didn't always take hold after European powers retreated from these countries that they had previously colonized. And so we call these two scenarios happening as the second reversal. And then we get to the third wave. So this began in the 1970s, and it includes the democratization of a variety of different areas, especially in Central, Latin, and South America, as well as post-communist Europe. Um, Up until recently, and we're going to talk about whether there is a fourth wave, we would have said that we're in the third wave, and this idea of democratic regimes finally replacing a lot of authoritarian regimes and a lot of liberalization finally occurring. And it's really intensified by the fall of communism. After the Soviet Union collapse, many former Soviet countries emerge as building their own democracies. So why do we get this explosion in the late 20th century of finally democratization, this third wave that really just increases the number of democracies around the world exponentially? So Samuel P. Huntington wrote a book called The Third Wave, and he tries to make sense of this emergence of democracy. And he gives 5 reasons that that there was such an explosion of democracy over this period of time. So the first is that authoritarian regimes were experiencing democratic or deepening legitimacy problems. Democratic values were starting to be widely accepted, and due to economic or military failure, these authoritarian regimes just couldn't keep their legitimacy. They were not performing anymore, and people were having issues with their regimes. This also came with, as I mentioned, economic growth in the 1960s. So living standards were increasing, education was increasing, the urban middle class was increasing. And with that, you see a lot of people starting to demand that with that new standard of living, that they also get new standards of democratic rule. He suggests number 3 is the striking shift in the doctrine and activities of the Catholic Church, especially with the Second Vatican Council. It's the idea of the Catholic Church in each country becoming less about, protecting the status quo and protecting tradition, and Catholic countries beginning to transfer over into democracy in a way that they hadn't previously because there was protection of tradition. Historically, there would be more closer ties between democracy and Protestantism, with this Protestant focus on the individual. And so with Vatican II, Catholic countries started to adopt that as well, this closeness to freedoms and democracy. The fourth was changes in external actors. So the European community is growing. If you want to be part of that, you need to be a democracy. Soviet Union collapsing, and countries now able to become democracy. And the fifth one is snowballing, or this demonstration effect of transitions earlier in the third wave, then stimulating and providing models for subsequent efforts at democratization. So Huntington really broke through to explain why there's such an explosion of democracies in that third wave. So where are we now? The question is one that is being asked by a variety of scholars. Are we in a third reversal? Is democracy decreasing? And some would say yes. In 2010, for example, the number of democracies dipped down to 114. We looked at Freedom House scores and polity scores, and we've seen that actually there are decreases in political rights going down, crackdowns on NGOs, independent medias. We talked about hybrid regimes and that a lot of regimes are just getting stuck kind of in this transition zone. We'll talk about that a little bit too with Crothers. And other countries that we thought were moving towards democracy, like Russia or Venezuela, and really never ended up making it. So there's this question, do we have actually a third reversal going on? And so a really good example of this, whether we have a third reversal or maybe we have a fourth wave going on of democracy, is to look at the Arab Spring. So that's a good case of, are we actually dealing with a fourth wave of democratization? It seemed like it at the beginning of the Arab Spring, but then we saw that it didn't end up having the same sort of success that a lot of people hoped it would. So I'm going to send you to a YouTube video to give you a kind of a basic explanation of what happened in the Arab Spring and why some people have been kind of disenchanted by it, and then an article actually on Vox that will also explain this idea of the failure of the Arab Spring. And many people have said that it really failed to produce the fourth wave of democratization in the Middle East that we expected it to. And so once again, maybe we're actually in this third reversal. So the last question, I guess, would be, what are those continued challenges then in terms of democratization? So the first one would be new media. And we saw in the Arab Spring an explosion of the use of the internet. But we also saw in the Arab Spring that it can be easily shut down or controlled by the state. So in Egypt, for example, they were able to just shut down internet access. You can see in China, for example, they have a cyber police, and they have what we call the Great Firewall. So the idea that even though we have all these new medias and the use of the internet that can really assist in democratization, instead we see that states are being able to control that media, control that technology, and that not actually being used in the way that we might think it does to help bring forward democracy. We can also see a number of economic recessions around the world. And, there's this kind of long-standing belief that voters will support whoever can find them food. And so if we do have larger economic recession, we saw a little bit of one in 2008 area, but if that continued and if that intensifies in any sort of way, you might see what happens after the Great Depression, where there is a slip back, where people say, I'm willing to have an authoritarian regime if it means that I'm eating. We also see a rise of socioeconomic inequality. A lot of people thought that democracy would solve this, but it hasn't. And there seems to be a surprising tolerance for differences in wealth. No real rise of a secure middle class like we saw in Britain or France or America in that first wave of democratization. But, if there begins to be problems with that, differences in wealth, that could cause some challenges for democracy. We see Western interventionism. So sometimes the West coming in, like we saw, for example, in Iraq. Obviously, you can debate that. But in some countries, the instability that comes with Western intervention actually doesn't really help with the process of democratization. So some people are disenchanted with, especially American pushes to democratize. We see the resurgence of religion, especially radical Islam, and terrorism, and that obviously having an impact on stability, and you need to have some stability in order to build democracy. And finally, ethnic conflict, that democratization can really stimulate organization along ethnic cleavages, along ethnic lines, and that can actually result in destabilization and trying to push some groups out of politics, which is really not the idea of democratization. And I think the kind of take-home thing is that, building institutions is tough. Building democratic institutions is really tough. And sometimes it takes a few tries to get it right. And oftentimes, a dictator is able to really clearly design an institution to be really reliant on the authoritarian regime. And, as I mentioned earlier, people are really willing to support a regime if it means that their stability and their safety is being protected, even if it's an authoritarian regime. So that's kind of our timeline of waves of democratization. First wave is those old democracies, Great Britain, France, America, really, according to Barrington Moore, this idea of the development of a bourgeois or a middle class that really, squeezes their way into power. We see the second wave being post-World War II and a resurgence of democracy. And then finally, this explosion in the third wave as characterized by Huntington. And then the question is, where are we at now? Are we going to have a third reversal? Is there going to be a fourth wave of democratization? that is something that, by the time I retire, maybe I'll have a clear answer to that. So that's what we have today for democratization. So please go over to the second video and take a look at what I'll be explaining about Carruthers and the transition paradigm, and then after that you can go and do the quiz.